Princeton Teach Us About Ethics, Virtue, and Sustainable Living. It was published in 2011 by Peter Lang from the UK and in 2012 by Princeton University Press. The book interrogates classical Greek thought, especially the ideas of Plato, to develop an ethics of sustainability. It is a tour de force. The author is Melissa Lane, professor of politics here. She came here from the University of Cambridge, where she taught political thought in the Faculty of History for 15 years. Her primary expertise is in ancient Greek political thought and its modern significance. Here she is the director of the Princeton Program in Values and Public Life. She's an associate faculty member of the Princeton Environmental Institute, which is hosting this event. And she's a faculty participant, as are two others of us in the audience, in the Communicating Scientific Uncertainty Research Network of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. Her previous books include Plato's Progeny, How Plato and Socrates Still Captivate the Modern Mind, and a new introduction to the Penguin Classics edition of Plato's Republic. She's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and of the World Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce. She's a alum of Harvard and an MPhil and PhD in philosophy from the University of Cambridge. Next year, she will be on sabbatical at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, supported by a Guggenheim Fellowship. Please welcome. Well, let me just one second. In the role of discussant, I will follow Melissa's lecture with a few remarks, and then we will have open the floor for questions. Please welcome Melissa.
Thank you so much, Rob, and I'd like to thank Holly Wells and everyone at PEI who made this lecture possible. It's a special pleasure to be chaired and commentated upon by Rob Socolow. When I moved from Cambridge to Princeton, one of my fears was how I would be able to connect to the environmental science and politics and thought community here at Princeton. And through a mutual friend, the former scientist of BP in London, I was introduced to Rob, and everything has followed from that, both our own friendship and all of the involvement in PEI and the Scientific Uncertainty Project and the other things that he's mentioned. So it's been really a wonderful thing for me to have that relationship. So let me begin with some remarks from Plato's famous allegory of the cave from Book 7 of Plato's Republic. What do you think would happen, Socrates asks, if a released prisoner went back to sit in his old seat in the cave? Wouldn't his eyes be blinded by the darkness because he has come in suddenly out of the sunlight? And if he had to discriminate between the shadows in competition with the other prisoners, while he was still blinded, wouldn't he be likely to make a fool of himself? And they would say that his visit to the upper world outside of the cave had ruined his sight, and that the ascent was not even worth attempting. So this allegory is an allegory of someone who challenges the fundaments of a social order. According to his presumptuous proclamation, what his fellows call success is actually failure. Their career paths to power and prestige lead to public damage, not public service. What they take to be solid facts are dangerous illusions. The technologies and infrastructure and assumptions in which they have invested their time and money and belief are fraudulent, wishful delusions. How could anyone be expected to tolerate such arrogant insults to their whole way of life? But if we pull the camera back on this scene, as Plato did, it appears in a new light. The busy self-righteousness of this political order might in fact be built on foundations of sand. The prizes they strive for are made of smoke and mirrors. In fact, powerful figures invested in maintaining these delusions parade the objects and languages in which the people believe. Denial of the external perspective looks from this vantage point like keeping one's head in the sand, refusing to face up to reality. A passive citizen body, a conniving and self-interested set of sophistic opinion formers, a systematically misleading and damaging order of political structures and beliefs. This is how Plato portrays the effect of his contemporary system of education. This is what he means by the cave. And it was through teaching this image of the cave to hundreds of people, old and young, students, senior citizens, corporate executives, and public officials, over 10 years while I was in Cambridge, in the University of Cambridge in England, that this began to nag at me as an image for climate change denial. For in clinging to the comforts and familiarities of our current way of life and its fossil fuel infrastructure, despite a mounting consensus of scientific studies documenting the damage that this is doing, are we trapping ourselves in Plato's cave? What would it mean for our conceptions of our cities and of ourselves if we were to dare to face the challenge of making our conveniences and competitions conform to the implacable demands of external reality? So I began to think about what would Plato think about the challenge of sustainability. And in doing that, I don't claim that he was actually thinking about ecological sustainability. But I propose that what his Republic in particular investigates is how to make a society socially and psychologically stable. That is, stable over time, not because of repression, but because people's motivations and values stably interact to produce and reproduce valuable social relationships. So my suggestion is that Plato's idea of stability is at the heart of, though it's not the whole of, what we mean by sustainability, which I define broadly as the production and reproduction of a society relating to the environment in ways that are both valuable in themselves and sustainable over time. Let me say a little bit more about sustainability here, because as that definition suggests, I think it has to be understood as a dynamic idea, which will continue to change and develop with context, and which relates crucially to ethics. It relates to what Plato calls a conception of the good, of realizing potential and improving quality of life. So in other words, what sustainability is actually a flawed shorthand, because it might suggest that we want to sustain anything and everything, but actually we don't want to sustain things that are bad. Actually, the normative definition of sustainability has to have ethics at its heart. We only care about sustaining what we think to be good. Now, it's important that sustainability doesn't by itself answer that question of value. It invites us to debate about how that might be filled in. And I think it also follows from this way of thinking about it that it's not actually right to say that sustainability should be our ultimate goal. It's rather that our goal should be to achieve whatever we value in a sustainable way. So it's actually more of an adverb than a kind of actual end goal. Ultimately, we would want sustainability as a separate goal to disappear, to be absorbed into and completely integrated into all the goods that we pursue. But in order to get to that point, we have to focus on it and see what it means and how we can build it in. So it has to be a temporary goal, even though ultimately it should be absorbed into our broader conception of the good. So how can Plato then help us to think about stability at the heart of sustainability? And my suggestion is not that we need him uniquely to do this. I don't say that there's the Da Vinci Code or the Plato Code, that if only we read the Republic, all will be revealed. So it's not that I think we can't think this way without him, but I think that actually his work can help us to articulate and appreciate social changes that are already starting to take place and give us a language for encouraging them further in the future. And so let me give you two examples to bring that out. The first is from an environmentalist, and the second is from an industrialist. And both of them demonstrate the power of what I analyze as Platonic thinking. So I'll say just a very few words about what I think is Platonic thinking so that you can listen out for those words in the examples, and then I'll afterwards say much more about where I think Plato develops these ideas. But so the words to listen out for are true value being gained through a holistic reorientation to the good, one which combines virtue and knowledge, such that doing what one believes is right becomes what one wants to do. That's the sense in which we can get a stability between the soul and the city through our psychology becoming oriented by our understanding. So as I describe these two examples, listen out for these ideas of goodness, wholeness, virtue, and knowledge, as these are the themes that I'll be drawing out of Plato in what follows. So the first example is a book called Carbon Detox. It's a great title, by the environmentalist George Marshall. And Marshall argues that people should detox from high emission addiction, not because it's morally right or altruistic, but because it is smart. So I take him to be exemplifying, although he doesn't know it, Plato's insistence that virtue is intrinsically connected to knowledge. So this book says, don't reduce because you ought to. And actually he says, you know the argument that we must all do our bit to save the planet? Forget this argument because it doesn't work. Instead, the book counsels, the real reason you should reduce your own emissions is because you want to live differently. When you detox from an addiction to all that causes high carbon emissions, you'll do it as a statement of who you are, a smart and aware person living in the 21st century. So whereas people often do damaging things through ignorance, those in the know will want to do what is savvy, what makes sense when it's considered in the full light, the light of being outside the cave. So without putting its case in these terms, Carbon Detox models this kind of ancient Greek approach to ethics. Pursue your own flourishing, your own health and happiness, and I'll be saying more about health as a Platonic standard later on, but do so in the most intelligent way, and we'll see that that involves the virtues and ethics of self-discipline and a spirit of temperance and moderation, justice towards others, and the courage to make both happen. Okay, so that's the first example. So we can now, in the second example, compare the prescription of Marshall as an environmentalist with the practice of Ray Anderson, the founder and CEO of Interface, an American carpet company serving businesses and based in the state of Georgia. And like Carbon Detox, I read Anderson's story. He's written 2 books about his environmental journey as the CEO of Interface, as an unwitting Platonic parable. It's one which combines a reorientation to the whole good with knowledge in a reconceptualization of his company's corporate strategy and mission. So Anderson's retelling of his journey begins with the harmful inertia constituted by the current neglect of sustainability in defining the scope of permissible corporate action. So he was stunned by reading Paul Hawken's book, The Ecology of Commerce, and he did this, there was a sort of perfunctory question by a client about what was his firm's view of sustainability, so he thought, oh, I'll read this book, and he had a kind of road to Damascus conversion. And he writes, I realized that I was a legal thief. The perverse tax laws, by failing to correct the errant market to internalize those externalities, such as the cost of global warming and pollution, are my accomplices in crime. So that led him, and this is the bit I'm more interested in, to challenge the firm to a radical goal, as he put it, to convert Interface into a restorative enterprise, first to reach sustainability, then to become restorative, doing good to earth, not just harm. So the Platonic goal of doing good defines the enterprise's new mission. And just as in Plato and in Carbon Detox, this is put not just as right, but as smart. And I think it's very interesting that Anderson compares his new strategic purpose to his original strategic purpose, the one that first made him all his money, which was the mission of carpet tiles. So his first business strategy was to be the first person to sell carpet tiles rather than big rolls of carpet. And then this new strategy, he says, he thinks of it in just the same way. This is now the smart business strategy, just like the carpet tiles had been the smart business strategy. So he doesn't abandon his goal of attaining value, but he redefined the parameters of value by adopting a target of zero waste and radically redefining what waste would mean for the enterprise. And he wrote, We define waste as any cost that goes into our product that does not produce value for our consumers. Okay, so value embraces product quality, aesthetics, durability, resource efficiency. And actually later the company declared all energy derived from fossil fuels to be waste that they want eventually to eliminate. Now they're not quite there yet, but that's their corporate goal. So that holistic way of thinking about the good, which is argued to be a smart strategy and not just the kind of ought strategy, but actually the smart way of thinking about a new business model, models the kind of rethinking of one's goals in light of the good and the whole, which a Platonic model of politics demands. So these examples show that the implicit thought of eco-republic is already beginning to be lived. And actually it was in confronting those examples that in part I was kind of led to want to write the book, because I thought that I had something to say about bringing these examples into a broader philosophical framework. So my hope is that by making this explicit, the book can help to contribute to the power and value of those sorts of initiatives. But so how can it do that? What is it that Plato and Greek thought can offer? And so my suggestion is that it can help us to understand the need to reshape our ethical and political imagination, which I take to be one of the causes of the current failure to address climate change sufficiently. It's not the only cause. I would by no means say that it was the only cause, but I think it's a significant cause, and I think it's worth addressing in its own terms. And to appreciate why this is important, we can go back to the very famous and important article on wedges, which Rob and Steve Pacala, the director of PEI, wrote some years ago and recently updated. Because what the wedges approach showed already 10 years ago was that actually we have the technology needed to address climate change. And so we have the technology. The question is, why aren't we doing it? Now, clearly there are a lot of reasons. There are invested interests of all kinds, and I don't mean to deny that. But I also think that there is a considerable degree of resistance based on what I think of as imaginative inertia, the sunk costs of what we take to be normal, our ways of doing things. And we can see this because even in the case of those wedges that would actually save us money, we're not even doing those. So it's not that we're doing all the easy things, but we're not doing the hard things. We're not even doing the easy things. And so then you really have to stop and think, why is that? If even the general motivator of money isn't getting people to act, then what is it that's stopping them? And my suggestion is that there's a considerable degree of imaginative inertia which stops us from acting. We can compare this to Cass Sunstein's idea of the status quo bias, which infects the making of law, in which new proposals for change are almost always at a rhetorical and argumentative, and I would say imaginative disadvantage, because we take the status quo to be normal. So we've always drawn the boundaries of value, virtue, goodness, and permissibility in a certain way, and those boundaries appear natural and necessary to us. And so it's hard for us to change them in ways that these sustainable solutions would require. Okay, so with that introduction then, I'll turn now to the two major substantive points of the presentation, which is to develop Plato's thinking about virtues and about the good. So about half of what I have to say in my remaining time will be about virtues, and then at a certain point we'll turn to think about the good. So for the virtues, though, I'm going to have a kind of wind-up introduction also to try to give a sort of broad brush account of why we might want to think about Greek and Platonic virtues today. And I'll suggest that by a parallel to the Greek vices that have been very widely identified at the heart of the financial crisis, and I think also apply at the heart of the ecological crisis, but I found better quotations from the financial crisis. So I'll start with that, and then I'll draw the parallel. So consider this New York Times columnist summing up two analyses of the cause of the financial crisis, which broke in 2008. And she wrote, "Hubris and greed and heedlessness." And then she added one more diagnosis of the players in the financial game who provoked the meltdown. In some cases, at least, they were downright stupid. These condemnations epitomize the worst vices known to the ancient Greeks: hubris or insolent arrogance, greed or rapacious and unlimited desires, which the Greeks called pleonexia, which means grasping for more, literally from the root for more, grasping. So you're grasping for more than your fair share. Heedlessness, the refusal to brook restraint, which the ancients would call intemperance or immoderation. And stupidity, which means in this case not intellectual incapacity, but an ability to understand real consequences and to appreciate true value, the kind of inability that you have if you're trapped in the cave of denial. If contemporary manuals such as Carbon Detox call for what are in fact, as I suggested, Greek virtues, here we see that we need these virtues because things that are really going wrong in our world are owed to the corresponding Greek vices. And so we can think in light of those vices of the corresponding virtues, because the word virtue, of course, can sound a little bit pious, but in Greek it's aratai in the plural, which means it can also be translated as excellence. It really means whatever it is that makes something good of its kind. So a knife can have the virtue of cutting well. It's much more of a functional kind of understanding as well as a normative one. So instead of hubris, justice, or fair play, instead of greed and pleonexia, self-discipline, intelligently limited desire, instead of heedlessness and recklessness, courage, and instead of stupidity, not just a mere calculating cunning, but reason or knowledge or wisdom. And these are actually the four cardinal virtues of Plato's Republic, so exactly the four virtues that correspond to the vices implicated in the financial crisis. And I think that what's very important about this is that this kind of diagnosis is sometimes presented as if it's just a diagnosis of a few bad apples. So sometimes you hear people say it was greed as if that was just a few people's greed, but that exonerates the system, the financial system in this case, as a whole. But actually, I would suggest, and this is the fundamental Platonic insight about the stability that's needed in the city-soul relation, that the habits and vices of many people, of the participants in a system, are not negligible within that system. They shape the values of the system even as they're reinforced by it. And conversely, the institutions are not immune to the qualities, the aspirations and habits, the vices or virtues of the individuals who operate within them. So when we talk about these vices, we're not just talking about a few bad apples. We're talking about the systemic reproduction of tendencies towards these vices, and that's what needs to be addressed. So just a couple of points of examples to bring that out. When the British Chancellor of the Exchequer argued that bank boards of directors must exercise good individual judgment as what he called the first line of defense against financial failing, his argument made headlines because in the institutional focus of modern politics, we've tended to neglect the fact that actually, ultimately, it comes down to how individuals make judgments. Now, that is shaped by the system, but it's still an important factor that operates within the system. And the same point was made about regulators here by Senator Christopher Dodd reflecting on the July 2010 financial reform bill. And he said, "We can't legislate wisdom or passion. We can't legislate competency. All we can do is create the structures and hope that good people will be appointed who will attract other good people." Now, I actually think Dodd was giving up too soon, in a way. He's saying we'll just create the structures and hope that people will be good. Actually, what we have to do is think about how do we create structures which will foster the virtues and inhibit the vices. And Plato, therefore, can help us to find language to articulate this importance of individual virtue and individual initiative. Okay, so here's the parallel. So if these virtues and vices are relevant to financial dangers, they're equally relevant to environmental ones. Indeed, many commentators have pointed out the parallels between the two crises. We can compare the mountain of heedlessly incurred, poorly understood financial debt, which ultimately collapsed, to the looming pile of heedlessly incurred, poorly understood overdrafts on the carrying capacity and the resilience of the planet, which we are continuing to amass. In fact, as some have pointed out, the two crises are not merely parallel, but intertwined. Mispricing environmental goods to the limit of zero is not just a technical mistake. It's rooted in the same outlook which mispriced financial risks. In both cases, it's the same blinkered division of labor in which a responsibility for the system as a whole and an understanding of the relation of our own action to that system disappears. So we've run up an ecological debt, which due to these same kinds of vices, which on the current economic model we can't afford to pay. So we might ask, well, historically, how is it that these vices, which were condemned by the Greeks, have cropped up so repeatedly in modern life? What has made us so susceptible to these repeated waves of individual failings, which engender these waves of crisis? And so the short answer, this is what the British call a potted history. It's a very, very, very short history of political thought, is that in the wake of the Reformation and the religious wars in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, greed started to seem like less of a threat to civilized society than fanaticism. And so the historian Albert Hirschman has traced the rise in the origins of commercial society and capitalism from the shift from what he called the passions to the interests. So there was a kind of rehabilitation of the interest of making money and individual gain as a way to moderate the passions of glory and fanaticism that had fueled the religious wars. So this is somewhat of an exaggeration, but from a Greek point of view, we can almost say that the 18th century then, in celebrating new licensed forms of luxury and greed, revived pleonexia as a virtue rather than a vice. That's actually going a bit too far. They were still aware that it was a vice, but in effect, by licensing it, it started to be such that it could be later celebrated as a virtue. At least we can say that they revived it as the lesser of two evils, encouraging people to pursue their interests in material accumulation as a safer path rather than pursuing their passions for heaven or glory. But now the price of that solution is becoming clear. By licensing unlimited pleonexia as in effect a virtue, it's something that we encourage people to pursue even if we don't sort of give them all the plaudits associated with virtue, we're starting to hit the wall with current technology of ecological sustainability. So what was the solution? What was meant to provide the solution to social peace is now part of the problem, undermining the sustainability of social life in relation to its ecological conditions. And so this means that many of the habits and assumptions of business as usual have to be changed. They have to be tempered and reshaped. So we have to see whether we can be smarter about how we identify, control, limit, and satisfy our appetites. So how does Plato help us to do that? Well, I've already started to suggest in broad terms the Platonic insistence on marrying the virtue of moderation to a virtue of intelligence, to be smarter about how we think about happiness and health. And I actually think that it's very important that Plato in the Republic, although the big picture of the argument is defined in terms of happiness, what will make us happy ultimately as individuals, actually when he comes to develop the detail of the argument, he actually turns to an account of health rather than happiness. And I think that's actually because the point that he's trying to make is that, again, we shouldn't be misled by this language of virtue and happiness to think that these claims are sort of optional or perfectionist, that this is, you might choose to pursue happiness this way or you might not. You might want to be virtuous, but you might not. The point he's trying to make is actually much more what philosophers would call an analysis of the basic conditions of successful agency. So he's not talking about virtue as a kind of supererogatory higher standard. He's talking about virtue as the precondition for the kind of agency that we need to be able to achieve our goals as individuals or within society. So by the virtues here, we don't mean a sort of optional perfectionist pursuit, but the basic parameter of health as the basis for agency. Now, there's a lot of different Platonic language in which he gives us this way of defining the health and the virtues. And I'll just read out one very famous passage from the Republic, just so you think I'm not making this all up. This is from Republic 4, where Socrates defines the way that someone who he calls the just man, who's also going to be the person with all of the virtues. So how does this person's inner psychic life function? And this is from 443 D to E in Republic 4. The just man will not allow the three elements which make up his inward self, which are reason, spirited motivation, and bodily appetites, to trespass on each other's functions or interfere with each other. But by keeping all three in tune, like the notes of a scale, will in the truest sense set his house to rights, attain self-mastery and order, and live on good terms with himself. When he has bound these elements into a disciplined and harmonious whole, and so become fully one instead of many, he will be ready for action of any kind, whether it concerns his personal or financial welfare, whether it is political or private. Now, it's the end of that speech that I rely on in part in making this more basic point about agency, right? He will be ready for action of any kind. He's not saying this is only the way to act if you want to be super virtuous. It's rather the virtues are what prepare you for action of any kind, actually including your personal and financial welfare. So this isn't a claim about what you need to do to serve others. It's fundamentally a claim about what you need to do to act yourself. But it turns out that the conditions for successful agency are also the conditions for a commitment to social justice. Okay, so for Plato then, I want to make one just last point about the virtues before I turn in the last 10 minutes or so to the good. And that is that, in a way, I think, and I've argued elsewhere in my work on Plato, that actually of the four virtues, so reason, courage, justice, and moderation, there's an important sense in which moderation or self-discipline, those are both translations of the same Greek word, sophrosune, this is the underlying scaffolding of all the other virtues. So moderation, I think, is the psychic core of all of virtue for Plato. While it's ideally completed by knowledge, it's also the condition for making fruitful use of self-knowledge. And this is because, actually, unless you have moderation, you're going to be constantly drawn away from the goods that knowledge would prescribe. So to adapt some phrasing from Kant on a different subject, self-control or self-discipline without knowledge may be blind, but knowledge without self-control is impotent. So like sustainability, self-discipline is not the highest good, but it's a condition for achieving that good. It's a condition for its stable, its sustainable achievement over time. Okay, so far I've tried to argue for this interrelationship of justice, self-discipline, knowledge, and courage. As we saw in Carbon Detox, being smart and self-aware is vital to the moderate self-discipline needed to keep self and society in healthy instead of destructive relationships. So far I've been arguing for the salience of the Greek virtues to solving both the financial and ecological crises. But Plato doesn't rest content with an account of the virtues, and here I'm moving to the last part of the talk on the good. And actually, there's a very nice moment in the Republic which makes exactly this transition. Because to the astonishment of the youthful Glaucon, one of the characters in the Republic, Socrates tells him that the highest form of knowledge will not be knowledge of the virtues alone, but knowledge of the good at 504D. And Glaucon responds sort of with puzzlement, because to him, as it would have been to the Greeks, and maybe even to us, it would have been obvious that cultivation of the virtues is the highest and most important thing to learn. If they're the keys to living a healthy life and contributing to healthy polity, it's sort of obvious that they would be important. But Glaucon then says, well, how could there be anything higher than the virtues, right? He's sort of on board with the argument up to this point, and then he thinks, well, we're done, aren't we? We've just talked about justice, courage, reason, moderation. Surely that's all we need to say. And Socrates says, and I think this is meant to be initially puzzling to Glaucon, and it only becomes gradually clear what is meant. He says, no, the highest form of knowledge is not the knowledge of the virtues, it's knowledge of the form of the good, because it's by relation to the form of the good that virtuous things derive their usefulness and value, 505a. So why is goodness the most important and highest thing to understand? And I challenged my freshmen in my freshman seminar in the Republic recently, why is it the form of the good and not the form of the just, which is what we think the Republic is all about? That's the highest form. So let me try and explain that. It's because the good, as Socrates says, is the end of all endeavor, the object on which every heart is set. What does this mean? This is a notion of goodness that derives from the ancient idea of the telos, or the goal or aim of action. So the thought is that for action to be intelligible, for us to be able to make sense of what someone is doing when they act in any way, we have to actually be able to articulate what they're doing as aiming at some good, something they understand is good. It may not be a real good, right? So this explanation would apply just as much to, a mafioso aiming at maintaining his standing in the mob as it would to a philosopher. What that person is doing and acting is aiming at what they believe to be good. Now, it will follow for Plato that we don't actually want to be aiming at false goods. If we were to discover as the mafioso, oh, actually, this is not a worthwhile good to which I've been devoting myself, then that person would want to change. They would no longer want to be pursuing something that they had realized was not genuinely beneficial. And there's a very interesting analogy, or rather contrast with justice, which Socrates draws here, which is that many people are content with the mere appearance of justice. People are content to get away with looking just, but not really being just. But no one is content with the mere appearance of goodness. We're not happy to think, oh, well, it looks like to other people I'm pursuing this worthwhile aim, but actually I've realized that in fact it's completely meaningless and pointless. That isn't something that we would intelligibly go on pursuing. So goodness is a sort of natural, genuine property which people prize for its intrinsic value. If I'm going to take medicine, I want it to be good medicine, not bad medicine. I may not be able to tell which medicine is good, but if I learn that I've been taking fake or faulty medicine, I'll feel cheated and alarmed. Good medicine produces real benefit, which bad medicine cannot. Now, that's actually the level at which I think the analysis of goodness can be helpful to us. I think that it's enough to simply ask ourselves the question, is this really good in light of the broadest scientific and philosophical understanding that we can bring to muster? So leaving the cave means thinking as holistically as we can about what's genuinely good, just in the way that we would ask ourselves, is this good medicine? Are these good friends or not? Now, of course, in the Republic, Plato goes further and wants to say it's not only goodness in some ordinary sense, it's the form of the good. Right? And there's a lot of debate in Platonic scholarship for centuries about what that means. Do the forms occupy some separate, intelligible dimension? Are they in heaven? What do we mean by forms? But I actually think that for our purposes of using the Republic to think about the problems that we face, we don't have to answer that problem. We can simply rest content with the insight that the key point is appearance versus reality. What appears good is not always what is really good, and so we have to interrogate apparent goodness in trying to formulate an understanding of genuine value. Okay, and the other advantage of that is that it also enables me to appropriate Plato in a less hierarchical way than the Republic's own politics. So many of you will be aware that, of course, the Republic, when I presented a version of this argument a year or so ago at the Center for Human Values, George Kateb said, this is an absolutely unbelievably crazy thing to think of wanting to do, because the Republic is this model of this very austere society dominated by an elite of philosopher kings. How can that be in any way a useful template for modern democracy? But part of what drives that hierarchy in the Republic is this assumption that goodness has some metaphysical status and property that only a few people will be able to grasp. But if we can do away with that assumption, then we can think that actually it's much more of a contextual and relative sort of argument that we need to make about appearance and reality. And so we can keep goodness as an orienting idea without the elitism and the metaphysics of the Republic. I also, in other parts of the book, reject this, what I call the asymmetrical assumption, this assumption that Plato has that social change can only come from the top, that you can only have viable social reconstruction if you start with people at the top and they feed it down. I actually think that what we can learn from him is that anyone can start that, although it's not what he officially taught, but we can take these ideas to mean that anyone can start a movement of social change from anywhere in society. So that's another respect in which I reject the Platonic hierarchy while trying to maintain other elements of his thought. Okay, so how might an idea of goodness, which at this point still sounds very vague, you think, well, yes, fine, but what is she talking about? How might that help us to think about sustainability? And I'm going to close now by suggesting 3 specific ways that we might start to cash out goodness as a way of thinking about sustainability. First of all, with relation to the idea of harm. Secondly, costs and benefits more broadly. And finally, the idea of growth, economic growth. So first of all, harm. So here, I think that actually we can see that we can, as I want to try to do, marry a form of this Platonic insight with a form of liberalism. Because one of the crucial tenets of liberalism is the idea that a free society rests on the freedom of the individual to pursue her goals so long as in so doing she does not cause harm to others. And that's, of course, a maxim of John Stuart Mill's on liberty. We call it the harm principle in political philosophy. But I think we can already begin to see that without changing any of the fundamental tenets or frameworks of our political philosophy, once we start thinking about climate change and other environmental threats, we see that we now have a new understanding of harm. And that may entail, if we feed it into the harm principle, very different limits on action than have hitherto been considered normal. So here I'm saying we don't need a new revised political philosophy. We just need to rethink the understanding of harm that we plug in to the harm principle. Harm which is indirect and slow, which accumulates on an ongoing basis, to which any one individual only contributes a tiny relative amount, looks very different from the harms with which the liberal paradigm has classically engaged. But it's not, I think, different in kind what we need to do. So just as the harm principle had to recognize that one thing that does cause harm is shouting fire in a crowded theater, now we're also going to need to find ways in law and public policy to take account of the more complex pathways by which contributing to rising concentrations of greenhouse gases can cause harm. Now, obviously, that's not straightforward how you do that, and it's going to have to be a matter of establishing standards of best practice for different industrial sectors. For example, production methods which are less efficient than a best practice norm could be fined or even shut down. But my interest is in the fact that we don't have to change our political philosophy in order to accommodate this understanding of harm, which of course derives, harm is only the flip side of an understanding of the good. So if we have a new understanding of the good, we can cash that out as a new understanding of harm. And indeed, it's interesting that already there have started to be lawsuits in tort for harms aggravated by human contributions to climate change. Some of them have been successful either at the district or the appellate level. I don't think any of them have been upheld ultimately, but there's a sort of gathering groundswell of litigation of this kind. Okay, so first harm. Secondly, costs and benefits more broadly. And again, deriving these from an understanding of the good. And I'll just tell you a little story that based on a real conversation of a friend of mine who was installing solar panels on his roof. I made it a woman in the book, but actually it was a man, who was challenged by his neighbor. And the neighbor said, those solar panels are never going to pay for themselves. And my friend said, well, didn't you just buy an expensive new sofa? And the neighbor said, yeah, I bought a great, beautiful sofa. And the friend said, but the sofa is never going to pay for itself either, right? Now, you can see the point of this story. It's that it's not a particular story about solar panels, that it's not that we want solar panels not to be cost efficient, but the point is that it's a question of what sorts of things we think have to pay their way in this kind of economy, and what sorts of ways of valuing we're prepared to establish in order to change our usual ways of doing things. And my sister is actually an environmental consultant, and this story really spoke to her because she said she often talks to people who say, I would love to do the solar panels, but I've done the math, and I'm just going to lose $10 a month. I just can't make it work. Okay, now let's assume those aren't people for whom $10 a month is going to be make or break environmentally. The point is that they're not willing to move into a way of thinking that this is something that they may actually have reason to value the contribution to sustainability, and not only to value it in terms of the current translation into dollars and cents that provides. Now, obviously, ideally, what we want is public policy to put a better valuation on the dollars and cents so that we don't have to make that trade-off. But in the meantime, our own valuations can start to change, and the way that we think of the choices and investments that we make can change. Okay, so finally, in light of a Platonic notion of the good, consider the idea of growth, and particularly economic growth, but let me start with a broader idea of growth. So obviously growth is a condition of life. Living organisms either grow or die, but it's become widely recognized in environmental economics that growth in terms of GDP is a poor surrogate for health, and it's a poor surrogate for sustainability. It's already a well-established point. GDP is liable to count increase in environmental bads as if they were good, while failing to count other goods, like time spent by parents with their children, as a good. Now, for Plato, the condition of growth is actually intelligibility, modeled as the light of the sun. So Plato actually says this. He says, plants can only grow if they're exposed to sunlight, and so people can only grow in understanding if they're exposed to the light of the good. Their ability, that's the condition for them being able to make sense of the world. So in other words, for Plato, growth must make sense. It must be meaningful. Otherwise, it's not good growth, valuable growth, but it's an anarchic, cancerous sprawl, right? Cancer is also growth, but we don't value that kind of growth. So that's another example of the way in which sustainability and growth have to have value at their heart. So how might we rethink growth, finally, in light of the challenges of sustainability? And I'll just give two very brief examples, and I'm not an environmental economist, but I find these very provocative ways of just stimulating us to think about this question that are offered by the ecological economist Herman Daly. So he says one thing you might do is to treat advertising as a social bad. So you could tax it as a pollutant rather than allowing it to be written off as a business expense. And another thing, even more radical, is that you might actually stop treating production itself as a good. You might think of production as a cost that you want to minimize. So we only produce new things when there's absolutely no alternative, and we've done our best to reuse old things and to do without having to produce the new things. Now, those are the sorts of ideas, I think, that can just help us to reimagine, to reinterpret, to rethink what modern society actually means by growth. Now, there's a much bigger issue here, of course, which, as you know, is the issue of, can we go on having growth as an ideal in the economy at all? Can we actually achieve the kind of decoupling of production from physical energy and resource use that might require? Or do we have to try to rein the economy into a kind of stationary state? And I think this is really still a debate that's very much alive in the environmental community. And I don't think Plato can solve that problem for us, but I think what Plato can suggest is that when we think about what growth looks like, if we draw on another Platonic dialogue, the Gorgias, one character there suggests that growth would just be, in effect, getting fatter and fatter as you consume more and more, right? But again, that idea of growth as a sort of untrammeled obesity is part of what a Platonic emergence from the cave would expose as an illusion. That's not valuable growth. It's dangerous and destructive. So unless we can achieve growth which is limited and balanced, which enables us to maintain a balance between individual psychology and public health, we can't afford to go on having growth. Indeed, any notion of growth that doesn't achieve that balance is just a hedonic con. So ultimately, for the Republic, sustainability has to mean having enough and living well. It prioritizes health over wealth and makes health and value the condition for growth. Thank you very much for your attention.
So a few thoughts to stimulate the conversation, although I feel a bit redundant. Melissa's written an important book because it starts the right conversation. It restarts the right conversation rather than starts the right conversation, because this conversation was more alive in Plato's time than it has been in the past 2 centuries. Plato asks, what is the good life? He gave answers for his time, and Melissa observes that we need to ask Plato's question anew, because there's something wrong with the answers we're giving today. Something askew in the relationship between our answers as individuals and our collective need. Our need is to pay attention to sustainability, but our individual choices are not responsive to that need. Melissa writes on page 20 that sustainability is about configuring society within the limits of the earth, so that over time, society will be ever more able to realize and instantiate the good. Sustainability is fundamentally a new challenge, one that needs all the insights philosophers can bring. It arises from prosperity. The richer the world becomes, the greater the urgency to engage with sustainability. Melissa derives insights directly from Plato's work, but she doesn't hesitate to, in her words, reject or reshape Plato's ideas where necessary. Like Vatican II, her goal is aggiornamento, bringing Plato up to date. Now, with 3 examples. First, as she said so eloquently, Plato extols moderation. Melissa asks what moderation might mean in new terms, when what is extolled instead is the zest for experience. Between Plato and us stand Enlightenment, Romanticism, and capitalism. Together, 18th century Enlightenment and 19th century Romanticism propelled the concept of individual self-fulfillment to abundance and variety. Over the same period, capitalism brought an economic system designed to address and stimulate individual desires. Melissa asks whether, with the help of Plato, quote, the current Western social model can be saved from itself, unquote. She asks whether the goal of collective prosperity might be modified for working out the meaning of, again, I quote, collective moderation. Moderation, she says, involves neither wholesale rejection of materialism nor reliance entirely on the technical fix to preserve every currently preferred form of consumption. She affirms that moderation on behalf of sustainability is no vice. Second, some of you have an echo. Second, Plato values thinking outside the box. That is what the cave image would be called in modern times. The walls of the box are constraints on normality, and inertia is what confines humankind to the box. Getting outside the box means bringing about fundamental change, the kind of change that ended slavery and is gradually changing the meaning of gender. Melissa has little use for Plato's elitism. We must all strive to think outside the box. And third, in addition to her using moderation and the cave, she endorses political imagination. She explains that exercising political imagination means thinking about how to live well as individuals in the context of living wholesomely as a collective. Plato insists, in Melissa's words, that we connect the city and the soul. Melissa's Plato can help us reimagine individual and collective well-being so that our individual choices are consistent with achieving a sustainable world. One important choice, for example, is the number of children we bring into the world individually and collectively. And this becomes something we discuss. Other choices concern how we consume, how much poverty we tolerate, and how much war we allow ourselves to indulge in. I close with a request that political philosophers think through an additional task for the political imagination, a task not in Melissa's book, but one she knows that I think about. It is not obvious to me that human culture automatically values sustainability. Why should those of us alive today care whether there are happy, productive, and creative people on this planet in, say, 200 years? Mustn't we first value the continuity of the human enterprise before we can value sustainability? The principal reason that I personally value continuity is that I see human beings engaged in a multi-generational project, a project of understanding our place in the universe, past time and future time. This project plays out on a larger scale than Plato's city, and it requires that we consider generations further in the future than those that Plato would have thought about. Can billions of people come to value this project? If not, can something else motivate caring about continuity? What we need, in another wonderful phrase of Melissa's, is a leap of initiative.
Let's stay up here.
Sure.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Comment on that.
Thank you, Melissa. That was wonderful. It was really good to see how Plato could be brought up to date in certain kinds of ways. I have one little concern, and it could be that a little bit of background. Some people in environmental ethics have been using virtue ethics and trying to think about that as a contemporary approach to the ecological crisis. And one of the criticisms that's been raised against virtue ethic type approaches is that they don't really go far enough because they are focused ultimately on human flourishing. So while your account is fascinating for the way it tries, as I see it, to bring ecological flourishing into a kind of human flourishing through stability, through knowledge, moderation, and so on, I think my worry is still that sustainability is perhaps doesn't go far enough to address the ecological crisis, and hence we might need another kind of ethic that is more direct, such as the view or the approach that we might have direct duties to non-sentient and sentient nature.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Emily. Emily is an environmental philosopher herself who's visiting at the Center for Human Values this year. So in one way, I think that you're right, that I think that there's a limit to this approach, and I think you've identified it, in the sense that I didn't set out to think about, how does Plato help us think about the value of nature or something like that. And I don't think that actually, So I don't think that necessarily that we would presume that this approach could help us to do that. Although there are, interestingly, some people who have written on Plato's works. So the philosopher Gabriella Caroni, for example, has said that in Plato's later works, and this actually bears on Rob's last point as well, that in his later works we get an image of humans able to understand the cosmos, and that ability to understand the cosmos is more widely available to people in his later dialogues than the ability of the few to understand the forms. And that gives us a sort of reason for caring about the cosmos in a certain way, and actually a project of understanding our place in the cosmos, which actually I think bears very interestingly on Rob's question as well. So I think there might be resources there in Plato actually to think about that, but that's not what I was kind of thinking about. And I just kind of limited my scope actually to thinking about the city-soul relation, partly because I wanted to use the template of the Republic, or that's what it was a sort of mix between wanting to focus on that and the sort of literary structure of the book sort of encouraging me to use the Republic, and the structure is that way. But the further response that I would make about that is that, I think that here there might be a difference between addressing the sort of public policy problems of sustainability versus addressing the concerns of environmentalism more broadly. So, it might, one way that I think it is not implausible to think is that really the problem of sustainability is a problem about humans. It's a problem about maintaining the conditions for us to live in a comfortable way on the planet. The planet is going to adjust to whatever conditions develop within it. It will, warm or cool, and things will follow from those processes. But that's only a problem for us and for other life forms. I mean, so there's an issue about other life forms, I accept. But in terms of the actual environment, and whether we should value that, I take it that to me is a kind of separate issue, actually, that isn't necessarily even best described by the rubric of sustainability. That may be a different project, which is a project of environmental philosophy and environmentalism. And the two things may overlap, but I actually think they may not be the same project, precisely because, as I was trying to stress, I think sustainability refers to our ethical concerns and, and kind of is shaped by them. Yeah.
I guess the question I have has to do with the crisis that provokes Plato to write the Republic. And that's in part, in large part, I read the death of Socrates. And so the first question I have is just to think about the Socrates is who would herald in these shifts in our political imagination.
Yeah.
What is their fate? I mean, and what are they condemned to? Even if that's imperfectly. The second question has to do also with, if not shift, or maybe it's really a question of terminology. Is this a matter of shifting, or is it a matter of crisis? Because for Plato, for maybe, is it Ray Anderson?
Yeah.
Interface carpet, there is this personal sense of crisis, which is not otherwise realized. And if I'm right in recalling my basic creed, crisis means inflection point, turning point. And so how much is that kind of personal and maybe collective a realization of crisis necessary for the shift in political imagination? Or is it an incremental shift in the way that it sounds, I heard in your description of sort of multiple starting places or initiators in this kind of broader project? So this is a question of crisis and how it appears.
Great, thank you. So actually both of those questions fit together very well with, actually, even though I spoke for a long time, there's actually still lots of things in the book that I didn't say, which is just that I was inefficient rather than, but which is that actually I do try to develop a dynamics of what would this initiative change look like? How could it be led? Which I think addresses both of those questions. And I do follow Plato in thinking that there's a kind of difference between the motivation of the initial people who may spark the change from the people who may then kind of follow along. And actually here I follow both Plato, but also literatures in law and sociology, the new norms scholars and so forth. So they focus on what they call norm entrepreneurs, that you just get these people who for whatever reason want to pioneer a new norm, and they sort of go out and do it out of an intrinsic belief in that norm. And then other people jump on the bandwagon because of reputation or because of some other reason. And so you get a kind of mixed motivations in the ultimate process of social change. And there are turning points and, tipping points and that sort of thing. Now, what I think is very interesting is that in that literature, as far as I know, they never say where would these people come from, like what would inspire those original people. And I think that this is exactly what Plato gives us a portrait of with his natural philosophers. So in Book 6 of the Republic, he gives us an account of people who are just instinctively drawn to love learning. And because they love learning, they're instinctively moderate. And because they're instinctively moderate, they're able to learn more. And they have a kind of commitment to this project, which, if the right circumstances arise, would enable them to kind of lead this change politically and socially. Now, I mean, there's always that dark possibility, which you rightly alluded to in the beginning of your first question, which is, well, somebody may set out on that quest and then, be stifled or ridiculed or rejected. I mean, the person coming back into the cave might be killed. There's certainly that prospect. So I don't think there's any guarantees in this. I mean, this isn't a story where, you know, there's a kind of guaranteeable mode of change that could happen, but I do think that the dynamics are sort of complex, and I think that one of the important things for those concerned with ethics is that we not have too high a standard that everyone should be motivated by the intrinsic thing. You know, the first people might be, but then the other people may come along later, and we would sort of expect that those are the dynamics of change that would occur. So I don't think that anyone has a kind of foolproof logic of social change such that we can say, you know, why did this Tunisian fruit vendor's suicide spark the revolution, but that one's didn't? Or, you know, I don't think we really understand the dynamics of social change at that kind of level, but we do see that it does require individuals to act, and then something does or doesn't follow from what they do. I do try to develop a kind of, I mean, in line with what Rob mentioned, which is, you know, this thing that I think that everyone can do it. So when I say everyone can do it, I don't mean everyone will do it. I mean, anyone could become one of these few, relatively still few people who might be motivated to start these changes, and they can serve as exemplars to others, and then that process may or may not kind of take off in driving this change. Yeah.
Thanks, Melissa. I really enjoyed it. And I have two related questions. So the first one was about the interplay between institutions and public policy and individual virtues.
Mm-hmm.
So here it kind of focuses a lot on the virtues of the individual, but there's sometimes contexts in which I can be as virtuous an individual as I want, but my institutional environment makes it very difficult for me to act on that over time.
Yeah.
So you might think about campaign finance reform. You might be a politician running for office. You might not want to take contributions from these wealthy donors. You might really be committed to that principle, but in the current context, if you don't take them, you're not going to be elected.
Yeah.
So I guess I was wondering to what extent can kind of change come about in individual virtues? To what extent does it rely on policy change? And then my second question is related to that, and that's an insight of modern political philosophy is that we can't rely, when it comes to institutions and public policies, on shared visions of what is good.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you think about how that applies to environmental policy. So the modern insight is that people disagree deeply about what is good. We disagree about matters of religion. We disagree about personal ethics. We disagree about aesthetic values. And I think we also disagree about the way of environmental values and other values. So when we're thinking about imposing environmental policy on people that may reject those values, how do we need to think about that?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Those are both great questions. So on the first question, and I don't do enough to develop this, but the point of the analysis I think should be developed to be that actually this should be an analysis that should guide institutional design, you know, precisely because of the point that you made. So the point about the city-soul interplay isn't just to say, so therefore we can only care about individual virtues or they could stand alone, but it's rather precisely we wouldn't expect them to be able to stand alone very well if they're not fostered by the city. So I think that actually I spoke maybe too much from the individual perspective, but I think the broader point has to be the one that you've made. But I would say, though, that you know, nevertheless, if we say, well, how do we get the policy changes? You know, this goes back to the previous question. I think it may often be the case that it takes some individuals who are willing to be in that vanguard of demanding the policy change, which may not mean, in that case, you know, it might be through instantiating the virtue, or it might be through pointing out that the conditions are such that they can't very well instantiate the virtue and calling for the conditions to be changed. But it often takes individual action to bring that kind of political change about. So I think that there is sometimes a bad habit in political philosophy of treating individual action and political action as if they were just dichotomous, you know, and saying, well, we shouldn't focus on individual action, we should focus on political action. But actually another story that I tell in the book is from the early days of Tony Blair's government in Britain, when he met with a group of environmentalists and said to them, you know, so how can the new government, you know, really establish our environmental credentials? And so one of them said, well, you could ban incandescent light bulbs. And he said, oh no, that's much too radical. You have to make it possible for us politicians to do that. Like, you environmentalists have to create the public climate in which the politicians can act. And I think that's actually very often the nature of public action on these things, is that actually you need a group of individuals, not, acting through institutions, but to bring about, through other institutions, to bring about those kinds of institutional changes. And so I think it's a mistake to sort of act as if these were an either-or kind of concern. The second question is a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. It's obviously at the heart of the sort of political sort of realism or otherwise of this project. And so the second question, to remind people, is the question about, in modern political philosophy, we have pluralism, so how can we agree on a shared vision of the good or a shared weight of environmental values? But the point of the harm principle example was to be that we actually don't think, even in modern political philosophy, that means that there are no limits to the pluralism. It's just that we've drawn those limits in certain ways that up to this point we've thought are acceptable. So we say, okay, we have shared pluralism, but we don't allow people to teach violent, religious war doctrines in schools. So there are clearly limits to the level of diversity that we're willing to entertain. And my point is that, and the point about the sustainability as a side constraint was that actually we have to start to think of sustainability in that much less controversial kind of way, as precisely a sort of logical constraint on the pursuit of all the other goods that we then debate about. So, it's fine to have a debate about, do we pursue capitalism or socialism, but both of those should be constrained by sustainability concerns. Now, I don't mean to say that that's going to be neutral or easy to work out in practice, but, neither are the limits that we already accept. Those are also litigated with cases, and people challenge how they should be. But my point is that logically, I don't actually think that I think it's a mistake to think of this as an alternative, rival, substantive vision of the good that's just another contender in the modern diversity space. I think it's rather logically a side constraint, and the problem is that we just haven't yet been used to seeing it in those terms. Yeah. Lars, yeah.
Yeah, maybe a little bit more of a practical issue of how change is affected given the human species, the limits of humans. I'm curious, it's hard, you can adjust your opinions and values to some, but it's hard to really think about the world in different ways, fundamentally. And I was thinking of what was the greatest example that I can think of a change in the perception of good. And I would actually argue that would be the transition in fertility rates globally, where it used to be we would predict exponential growth, and then all of a sudden it was a surprise to everyone that in developing countries fertility rates dropped, like Iraq, Brazil, they're less than the US and so on. But what's clear, if you look into that, and this is not my field, but my understanding is, what's clear is it's a generational change. It speaks something to that the issues you're concerned with within the human soul may be set very early on, and that there's some latitude after that, but there's some lag time on the scale of generations. Can you comment on any of those things?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a really interesting example. I mean, I'd been thinking about examples like, sort of when people always talk about smoking and big game hunting and sunbathing and things like that. But this is actually a very interesting example partly because it touches something so fundamental to what had been the definition of the good life and how to pursue it. And then it sort of came about not because of actually prescriptions. I mean, there were prescriptions, but more because of opportunities that became available to people to think about their own lives and the values that they might want to realize in a different way. So it is a very, very interesting example, I think. In terms of the lag time and the generational time, I mean, that's a really interesting question because, in some way, I'd been kind of thinking in the opposite terms that, well, some of these infrastructural things are very hard to change, but we can change ideas much faster. And then your sort of suggestion is, well, actually, no, maybe really changing ideas, might actually take much longer and be slower. And if that's right, then this project is not going to have very good prospects, I think, which, maybe so. I mean, that's possible. But I mean, on other issues, gay marriage or something like that, that's on the scale of decades, and there is a question of whether even that is soon enough, is even decades soon enough to, and it may well be that, we get into a much harder place before some of these changes kick in. So I think it's helpful to be reminded that just because mindsets might seem more within our control, that doesn't actually mean that they may be as changeable as we might think, partly because of the interplay with institutions that was also talked about. It's a very good question. I think I need to think more. I think I need to think more about it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Very interesting and inspiring. But I too was interested in this sort of interplay between individual action and institutional structures and that constrains the imagination and how difficult it is to think outside these norms. Therefore, how do you get institutional change? But you sort of addressed that issue. But I just wanted to ask you to say a little bit more what level you think institutional change best takes shape. So I'm thinking about, the sort of very disappointing results of these international conferences like the Kyoto Accord and how, distressing it is. And I mean, almost, it sort of seems almost counterproductive to have these sorts of meetings which don't seem to go anywhere except to sort of get people's, or, states sort of locked into certain positions. But on the other hand, the level of the CEO who changes a certain practice of the business, which may have, implications for how a certain industry conducts itself. And, maybe that creates the environment, as we gave in your Blair example. The government actually follows suit with some regulations. So I wondered if you thought that there was really a level appropriate to institutional action or institutional change, and that other levels are just, kind of counterproductive.
That's a very good question. I mean, I think it is, partly an empirical question. I mean, it's turning out that on this issue, the international agreements are just not working very well. They have. I mean, Kyoto worked, but the problem is what is going to replace it. It didn't work. Well, it worked and it didn't work. It was in effect. It didn't have the outcomes that one would have hoped, partly because of the mechanisms. So I guess one thing that I think would sort of follow from my general approach would be that it's more likely to work on levels where there is the possibility of people to kind of observe and interact with each other, and where best practice norms really have some kind of effect. So actually, the business sector is actually a very good case for that, because often people think, oh, the business community is, it's all just the bottom line. But in fact, there's tremendous pressure of peer pressure and best practice, and there's all kinds of soft norms that people are very sensitive to, in fact. And so that sort of level of institution, like arenas where you have institutions that are in a competitive ecology and people are, sensitive to the results of their practices and their influence on others, I think are sorts of ecologies where this is maybe likely to kind of be successful. Going back to the institutional individual question, I do maybe slightly naively and romantically kind of think, well, we know that it's an interlocking dynamic, institutional individual, but if you have to cut the Gordian knot somewhere, I cut it at the individual. I think that Plato's view of the natural philosophers is that that's what you have to do. You just have to have a few individuals who, for whatever reason, are willing to put it on the line and go for the change, and then they may or may not be able to spark the greater change in the institutions. There's one other Tony Blair story which is even more kind of cynical about that, where he actually then, after 10 years, kind of essentially said to the business community in England, look, I need you to make an alternative business lobby who can lobby me publicly to make changes for climate change regulation, because the existing business lobby is, lobbying on the other side. And literally, like he said that, and they created a lobby, sometimes we can be too romantic about civil society and institutions and whatever. Often, government kind of knows what it wants to do, but it needs the cover, and individuals who are savvy can provide that cover. So anyway, I just wanted to say that because it was an interesting story. Michael, yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for that. I really enjoyed it a lot. And I guess the question maybe falls on Tori's about your response about soft norms. And I really like the idea that you talk about trying to be a certain kind of person in the 21st century. And I wonder, what role does shame have in that? Either shame for corporations or shame for individuals, that being a certain kind of person, what role does kind of esteem play in the sort of sense that people are talking about?
No, I think, this is an important question, and I kind of haven't done quite enough with it. I think partly because I got interested in this idea of sort of intrinsic motivation, and the economy of esteem seemed to be different from that. And even though I then said, well, there's these mixed motives downstream, but I kind of just relegated it to that part of the story. There is a way in which one can think of esteem as a much more kind of fundamental measure. And there have been psychological and sociological experiments where, for example, you print on people's utility bills how their usage compares with other people's usage in their area. And that has kind of mixed results, because sometimes it's quite good, it makes people, but then sometimes people think, oh, I'm doing quite well, or something, I'm already doing enough, or something like that. I haven't thought about shame so much directly. I think it's true that my approach of the exemplar, sort of the obverse of that, is a kind of shame or discomfort, that whenever one sets up a standard, I think there is a kind of implication that if someone isn't living up to that standard, that they may take a look at themselves, and whether or not that's set out as an explicit shaming mechanism, it may well have that effect on people's kind of internal judgment. So I don't feel I've quite sorted out this interplay also that that I was speaking about earlier in terms of Arif's question in terms of the exact relation between intrinsic motivation, shame, esteem. I think there's more to kind of be done here. Yes?
Final question.
Yeah.
I was wondering, from the point of view of historical evidence, I should say, the science, so evidence really matters. Is there any real evidence that Plato can help us? After all, he was a conspicuous failure in Syracuse in his work on methods. And the Republic, being as Popper and others have shown, is almost a blueprint for fascism and totalitarianism. And why is it that we're discussing this? We're not listening to the one Greek philosopher who can speak to the empiricists, who wrote the ethics, the poetics, and the politics, not to mention logic, biology, and so on, Aristotle. Well, what did he contribute? Is it nothing compared to Plato?
Great, thank you. Good. Well, there's a lot in that question, and it's an important question. Let me first of all say I do, explicitly, obviously, have to address, and do in the book address, the question of Popper's interpretation, which obviously is a kind of block to anything that I want to do. And my argument is that actually the Republic is paternalist, but I think that the evidence that he tried to bring that it was totalitarian, it depends in part on a misreading of some parts of the text. So, for example, there's a famous passage in the Laws which says, no one must ever be left alone, everyone must always listen to their superior. But the beginning of that paragraph says, in the context of military training, blah, blah, blah. So now, Popper was a good scholar in many ways, and I think he's an important thinker, so I don't mean to say, oh, we should just toss him out, but I actually think that some of the things that he said were totalitarian, I think. But, what is true, and I myself have also worked on, is that certainly Plato was appropriated in part by Nazi thinkers. That I think is absolutely true, and we have to confront that fact. But he was also appropriated by feminists and Democrats and idealists. He's been appropriated on all sides of the political debate, so I don't think we can privilege Popper's reading necessarily over these others. So that would be one thing. The second thing is actually a recent book by Danielle Allen has tried to show that in the time, despite the failure in Syracuse, actually if you look at the influence of Plato versus Aristotle on the 4th century orators in Athens, you find much more Platonic language, vocabulary, and imagery adopted by the orators. And her hypothesis is that this is precisely because of Plato's greater use of images and metaphors, like the cave, like the sun, like the good. And so when you say to me, well, what can Aristotle offer? Actually, I think he can offer a lot. But there were two reasons that I had for choosing to focus on Plato. So one is that actually in contemporary virtue ethics, people almost always appeal to Aristotle rather than to Plato. And I think that by doing that, one of the things that you actually miss is this very explicit attention to the good and the context of the whole that I think Plato offers, and without which I think virtue ethics isn't complete. So it's not that I wouldn't learn from what Aristotle has to teach us, but many more people have written about that than have written about this. And then the second thing was this literary element of the Republic, that actually Aristotle doesn't have any work that gives us that kind of literary roadmap for thinking about, and images for thinking about the relation between the city and the soul. He does talk about them in the, we obviously disagree about this, but he talks about them in the Ethics and the Politics, but he doesn't give us the kinds of literary images that Plato gives us in the Republic. So, okay, well, so that's obviously something we disagree about. So, yes. Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you all for coming.